Okay, so here we are
Hello.
again. Um, this is interesting. We've spent a couple of sessions, the last like three, I think, shows talking about use cases and scenarios and reasons why vector can be so powerful. But we kind of straddled a bunch of different options like where you do things and how you should do things and at the end of the last one we kind of said, you know what, design and
Yeah.
how you design for this is important. Or I mean, I could even dovetail that and say, how do you leverage this in existing environments as well? So off to you, because you know this way better than
Yes,
I.
although I want to get you riffing on this because it's this is actually the art. I really think
Yeah.
that this is where the art is. And let me put some things on the table and then let's see where it goes. So
Okay.
first thing to put on the table. So you have an embedding. So I have, let's say I'm embedding my property listing information. Where do you store that? That's the first question. And
Yeah. Where
so
does that embedding go?
where does that embedding go? And it's a fat embedding, presumably. Like it could be smaller dimensions, but it's still fatter than an integer value. And
Yeah, for
so
sure.
if you think about it this way, if you want to keep things simple, you could say, okay, just add an embedding column to your existing table. So every row has all of its property listing, beds, baths, description. And then if you're just learning it, you put in that embedding to the table.
I'm already nervous here.
I know. I'm spiking. We should actually do one of those heart rate monitors to like watch as I. And there's no primary key. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, you
No, there
you
has
must
to
have
be.
that. There has to be, yeah. So there's that scenario of just keeping it nice and simple, and we could talk about where that'd be recommended. But most DBAs will have an intuition that that isn't your every case. That should probably be a quick proof of concept, small number of rows.
I mean, anyone that's taken internals is going to know that changing the structure of the row, especially significantly, can actually change and terribly change the the caching and the use of that table, the logging of that table, so many factors.
Let alone if you have a read-only index now on top of it, what what kind of inconvenience does that add to your life? But that's a ideally,
Oh,
hopefully, a temporary thing, but
exactly.
still,
Hopefully that
it's a yeah,
restriction doesn't last long.
right. So then other things on the table, and again, I'll back off from it. And you tell me which ones we can go into. But then there's the okay, no, I want a separate table to hold my embeddings, but it's not quite that simple, right? Because um, are you also chunking your data?
Right.
Because now one document might have multiple chunks, and then those multiple chunks might have embedding. So that's a decision point. Let's put that on the table, chunking. The other thing is, do you want to be able to track provenance or model versioning over time? Because these things move fast. There's lots of different cool embedding models that come through. They have different number of dimensions. You might want to rotate new ones in and see how they perform and then deprecate the old ones. So do you want to have a junction table that basically says, here's the active embedding, here's the new embedding that we're looking at, but it's not active, here's a deprecated one that we're eventually going to move out. Then also think about the fact that the dimension count is a thing that you tie to that particular column. So if you're saying, okay, I'm going to have a new number of dimensions, you can't just reuse that
Right.
column. You need a different column. And so you could see the kind of mess that can happen through just natural progression of changing your different models, your embedding models over time.
Well, I
Anyway,
kind
I put that mess on the table for you and go, okay, let's
Well, would you
discuss that.
consider having each embedding model as a separate table because their dimensions might be different, the way they're going to process it might be different, and you may even want to keep multiple models around
Let's talk
temporarily
about
at
that.
least.
Let's talk about that aspect because, by the way, this is where we are like we should almost have like flashing red. This is where it's art over science, but getting it
Right.
wrong, there's a lot of consequences. You're absolutely your intuition on should we keep things around? Absolutely spot on because think
It's
about it
just
from
size,
the well also
storage.
well I'm actually thinking about it from a regression perspective.
Right.
Let's say, and I have seen this firsthand, where you have an embedding model that's been around for about a year that I was looking at, and I was embedding the data and seeing what kind of performance was it having, like what was its recall, was it showing the right data, were the results good? So basically the evaluation of the results, and they were good. And then there was a new model announced, and I'm not going to name names just so we can kind of not be in that, but there was a new model announced, and it scored much better on the MTEB. It was
Mm.
basically had all the benchmarks,
It
just
looked like it was
completely
going to be
beat this,
great. Yeah.
ran it, and everything regressed. So everything, the actual embeddings, it did okay, but none of it was the same results. Like if you had like a top 10 matching, maybe 2 out of 10 matched the prior,
Wow.
and the prior was better
Okay.
in terms of
For
that
what their use
evaluation.
cases were and how they were
Just happened to
analyzing the
be
data.
that
Yeah.
combination. So
Yeah.
if only life were so easy that you could just say, okay, if it's top of the benchmark, it'll be top with your data, but that is not the case.
Right.
So what if this were real production? And you just went ahead and you migrated over to this new embedding model. You did the
Right.
cutover and then you just happily deleted everything else. No. And oftentimes you don't know whether there's been a degradation in the search performance and the quality of the results and the precision and the recall. And also, even things like this, like which results you might have the right top 10, but they're not in the right order. And there's some
Right.
cases where it needs to be one or two,
And
otherwise people
and
move
it
right on,
matters. Yeah, yeah,
and that
exactly.
matters. Yeah, so that like and so you want to keep a certain period of time where you go, okay, we're noticing people are downvoting these results, or we're seeing a drop off in engagement, and whatever happened with this new model, it's not working. We should revert.
Right. Okay.
So that's the other thing, is as a DBA or a database architect, you want to think about the ability to revert. The other thing is you want even a smooth cutover. So if I had that model switching table that says, here's the active embedding model, where you can
Right.
keep multiple embedding models active at a time, and you can go, okay, my stored procedure always checks that flag equals 1.
Right.
Well, what if you were to flip it to go, okay, when this flag is 1, you pull this particular model?
And I guess you wouldn't have to worry about the dimensions or any of the
If it were the
sizing.
same dimension count, that's the complexity beyond that. So if
Mm,
if you have different, now all of a sudden it's not quite so easy to just switch over seamlessly if you
right.
need another table. But this actually leads to, I think, where you're going to be super interested, when we're talking about maybe a view on top of.
Yeah, because then you can actually have active and then what view or stored procedure you would use corresponding to that. But depending on how you brought that back to the app, it still would be the same results though. So you'd be okay even if the structures were different. You would just use a different procedure or a different view to analyze the data. So I think you could, and that would be, I agree, the better way to do it is to kind of have this linking table that takes whatever your app is to what should be used, but then always make sure that the view has the same columns or the stored procedure has the same output results.
Yeah.
And then it
Yeah.
doesn't matter what model you're using or how many dimensions and so forth.
I think let's step back on like all the decisions that we were just talking about that as
Yeah.
a DBA ideally you're involved with. So the decision of somebody decided on an embedding model, but you need to know, okay, then where are we going to store it? Is it going to be in line with the existing data or in a separate table? Most of the time it's going to be a separate table. Okay, are these very large documents that you're trying to embed? You're probably going to have to chunk them. So how do we want to handle chunking? And then if you're not chunking, it's just, these are relatively small embeddings across like a small property description, and you're just dealing with a specific table, do we still want to have that provenance? Do we want to still be able to check, okay, this is associated with this model that we just started using on this date and it's now active? Like, do you want to get into that business of tracking that history over time? And then how do you handle switching data out? What are you comfortable with where enough time has passed that there's no more risk of regressions? Now we switch things out. And what's the most efficient way to switch things out without causing performance issues, right?
So I have an idea on that because when I deal with really large tables, right, often the data is time related. I'm not going to say it's always time related, but let's just say the more current data is the more active data, is the more critical data, is the more, need my statistics and everything to be updated more frequently. So I tend to think in terms of, I'll air quote partitioning, but for me, it's not necessarily the feature table partitioning. It's more separating. I don't want to say chunking because I don't want to confuse that, but my idea is to take, let's say, 2026, March is the current month. When we look at earlier months, February, January, there might be some changes still happening, orders that need to have shipped because something was back ordered, whatever. But as we get into 2025 and certainly 2024, 2023, and maybe we keep 10 years of data. So my point is, we might want to analyze all of somebody's purchases
Yep.
across 10 years of data. Once we have picked our embedding model and embedded that data into an embeddings table based on descriptions or whatever it is that we're going to embed, the nice thing about having it as a separate table, especially for 2026, is that it wouldn't impact the new data that's coming in. I might even argue that I might not even do that as much on the new data. I might wait. That's debatable. But again, having it in a separate table helps. And then in the older data, if you do want to eventually change the model, the beauty there is you might not be getting as much action on the older data. So, taking it out of a view or a stored procedure such that you only go back 7 years while you're messing with that data, and then you're putting it into a new embedding table, and then maybe even just getting rid of the old embedding. That's debatable. I mean, the best way, the most amazing way is to have enough space to do it all, right? Which is to have the old embedding model, to have the new table with the new embedding model, so that you're always using the old embedding model across all of the views, which are all of these related tables by, let's say, year, because that's also a very easy way mentally to view that data or to see that data. So I'm a big fan of not having a single large table, but having the concept of orders being spread out based on something that is very easy to visualize, like time, and then relating the embeddings into tables from those. So there might be a 2020 orders and a 2020 order details, but then there might also be a 2020 order details embeddings, right? Or something like that, so that you have this structure which is very obvious, which is very consistent naming wise, and then can also be very consistently accessed with views. And I think it gives you that strategy for read write not being as much of a concern, and it gives you the power to change things, but to change, and you could do this strategically, change the newer data first and to bring that online faster, or one could argue change the older data because it's not being accessed as much and then flip everything over. So you have options. And sorry, that was my little partitioning tangent.
No, but by the way, it I think it represents the complexity of the decisions that you don't want to sleepwalk into.
Exactly.
Because even thinking about if you decide to keep old embeddings around, that also means that your search string needs to use that old embedding model because there's not a compatibility there.
Right.
You change dimensions, you change model, any of that. They're
All
not
of it
related
has to
anymore.
change. Right.
Exactly. But it was leading me down a path of, okay, if you preserve that, then you almost need to say, okay, here are intermediate result sets across the different models and their top 10 results if you're doing KNN across all 10.
Yeah.
You get into some questions of, will that really work? Is that what you want? Or do you want, it always needs to be the whole corpus? And so, and by the way, and I don't know the answer to that question. It really depends, I think, on the domain.
It's application dependent. I mean, it's do you want to search by year and find results until you find 50 rows, and then do you want to stop? Or do you want to find 50 rows that are closer in precision over more years?
Right.
And,
And I agree with you on the recency, like some of these cases where it's like, okay, well, you're not even going to check that anyhow. You may be looking at the most recent data.
It's rare that you would go back 10 years, but it's not impossible, right?
No.
So you want to have that option, especially if you have that data and you have the space to do that keyword matching and that semantic search. But then you want to look at kind of the wider view of things and maybe go back. There's also legal. I start thinking of legal requirements like 10 years in some countries, 7 years, and so, depending on whether or not it's financial.
Yeah, because it's not. It needs to be accessible. And so, what does accessible mean, by the way? Because does that mean if I'm calling an API provider and I don't have a local model and they deprecate, are essentially removing the key to be able to even generate new search phrases, for example, to search against our data. That's, one example there that I actually I've never explored that particular question before.
No, that's
That's a good
interesting
one.
because you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, if this isn't the type of technology that you're going to set up once and forget about. I mean, it's like indexes. It takes
Yeah.
fine tuning and it takes time to make sure that things are working correctly, and workloads change and users behaviors change, the way they use the data changes. So the way you're doing your embeddings may need to change as well, and the models you're using. And in 2 years, the language learning that will encompass 2 more years worth of knowledge is going to be that much better. So
Yeah.
we need to be able to take that
I think
into
people will be
account.
keeping up. I think that's
They
they'll be
have to.
driven to
And that's what I'm
re-embed.
saying. They
Yeah.
have to. It's one of those things you can't just set it and forget it. So, okay, this is fascinating. Again, some design decisions that you need to make early. I mean, God, we've always been telling people you never directly access the data. There's always you know what I mean? There's always
Yes.
stored procedures, functions, and
Yeah.
views.
This is a big blinking. This reinforces that.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
having that model that the stored procedure well, the view would be difficult. It would just be which view to use. But the stored procedure could do it programmatically, or it could be a new stored procedure. So you've got options there. So,
And then
okay.
what can we? I'll end with this. What can we do to make sure the agents use those stored procedures? That's the other one
Oh,
I'll leave you with. Because again, this is the keep me up at night of okay, that's all well and good. I wrote a post on this recently about policy based or PBM. Do you remember PBM?
oh yeah,
And
barely.
I remember thinking
I love the concept of it.
I did too, and that was the whole post was like I thought it was the right concept at the wrong time, and now more than ever we need a PBM for agents. Like, hey, when you come in, here's your list of rules. These are things that you never do. Here are things that you always do. Like in your particular example, like, hey, I know you can see those tables over there. I don't want you writing a query directly against them. I want you to always use this store procedure to access
I mean,
this.
that's been verbally our rule forever. I mean, that's even the same policy that the SQL team takes in having, stored SPs and catalog views, that all, just having that layer. They don't let anybody touch the tables directly, and that should be the same thing in your design. Now we're just adding a which AI model are we using, especially if there are multiple, and it could be that you want multiple to compare them, contrast them, see how they differ. But that's, again, if it's designed well, it's easy. And some kind of centralized or day one smack around the developer and say, you need to do this. You need to go to
Yeah.
this doc, go to this process, read this first, always do this. And it'll have to be in your name change or name policies and standards document. But I mean, we've all
I don't think,
seen
I mean, by the way,
they don't
I
always
laugh when you
work.
say read this document.
I
No,
know, I
they're not
know.
gonna. But the agents, that's the part we should talk. That should be another episode of just talking about how does one design in an agent-led world that we're in now.
Yeah,
And a year from now, I think things will
it's
be
even going to
almost
be even more.
unrecognizable
Yeah,
on this. And so it's whether we like it or not, like the agents are going to be in there. What can we do to guide them to best practices?
yeah, yeah. Look out for Mr. Smith. So, okay, I'll end on that.
Thanks, Kimberly.
Thanks, Joe. All right, bye.